I'm going to show you how I use a plastic store card cut up to create semi-abstract watercolour paintings. Let's get started. There's one free tool that I use a lot in my watercolour painting, and at the end of this I'm going to show you the different paintings where I've used the plastic card. It can be an old bank card. This is my AA card. I've been sent a new one, so this one has expired, and I'm just cutting it with the scissors, and I'm cutting different sizes, and this will really help me with my watercolours. So some will have long sort of sides that I can print longer marks with, and others I'll have shorter sort of sides, and I can use it for much more detailed stuff and actually dip straight into my pans. A lot of the times with my pans I'll squeeze out freshly squeezed paint and I'll use that to print with, and I'll show you later how I do that in this tutorial. And as you can see here, I use the sort of flat side here, but I also use the point of the plastic card as well. So it's so useful and versatile and free. So let's get started showing you how I use the techniques that I use with this plastic card. So what I'm doing here is I'm using my size 8 brush and I'm mixing up some burnt umber at the top, a little bit of yellow ochre there, some ultramarine, and I'm going to use some indigo. If you want some colour alternatives, check out the description below. I'm just sort of drawing in some rocks. When I first started using a plastic card, I used to use it a lot for painting rocks. So what I'll do is I use this sort of creamy paint. Don't use the paint too watery, it doesn't work as well. So you want sort of a milky mixture, and I'm just painting the lightest colour, the yellow ochre, first. And if you notice, I've left a little bit of light on the top of the rocks on the right hand side. I'm now dropping in the burnt umber, wet into wet, leaving that yellow ochre at the top, so it's sort of 50-50, and then dropping in a little bit of the ultramarine and the indigo, the darkest paint, at the bottom there, wet into wet. So I'm going to let that dry off a bit. I don't want to use the plastic card too early, it doesn't work as well. So you still want a sheen on your piece of paper, on your watercolour paper, but you don't want it too wet. So I'm just doing this freehand now for those of you that want to be a little bit more loosened up. I'm doing exactly the same thing but without the outline drawing. Sometimes it's quite nice to be spontaneous and not have outlines to sort of restrict you a bit. So I'm going to use the side of the card now to swipe off the watercolour paint, and I've waited for the top one to dry off a bit. Now you can still see there's a sheen there, and I'm just sort of almost like a windscreen wipe. I'm sort of swiping. If you can see here, I'm going to demonstrate that there. Swiping. Do it quite swiftly and don't labour it. Don't go back and forth because you can tear your paper and it can look quite muddy. It does take practice, but it's so much fun to do. So do have a little practice. So as you can see here, I'm swiping just once in an area, and then again I'm showing you there swiping, and just going right around and almost just sort of lifting off the paint as you do it. Do it quite swiftly and smoothly. It's so much fun. It's fun practicing, and you can actually swipe off smaller detail rocks as well. If your paint has dried too much, as the one on the left has here I'm pointing to, just re-wet it gently again and then leave it again till the shine goes off a bit. What I'm showing you here is using very watery paint and going in too soon, and as you can see there, you don't get the darks and you don't really get that lovely contrast that you get with the milky paint using darks and waiting for that right moment. So I've gone in again on the rock that had dried and I've re-wetted. It does work, but not as well as going in first of all. So really sort of make sure you go in at the right time, and that's when the shine is still on the paint but it's sort of drying off a bit, and it's really worth practicing so you get the instinct to know when the right time is. Now I'm going to use the corner of the cards, the sharp corner and the rounded corner. So I'm actually painting some light green cadmium yellow with some ultramarine and a little bit of burnt umber to make a mid green here, and I'm going to use some of the indigo as well to make a dark green. So it's quite a nice way of painting grasses. So while that's drying off a little bit, waiting for that sort of window of opportunity to lift off, I'm actually painting sort of a flat area of grass. So light, mid and dark green here as well. So here's my opportunity. I'm using the corner, the sharp corner of the card as I'm pointing to here, and I'm lifting off quite swiftly to reveal thin white lines. So I'm lifting off that watercolour paint. So now I'm going to use the rounded corner of the plastic card and do the same thing, lifting off swiftly, and you get sort of larger marks, larger grasses. So it really is an effective tool for creating and painting grasses, as you can see a close up here. If it's too wet, the paint all runs back in on itself, so just wait a few more minutes. So again, here is the flat wash, and what I'm doing is I'm using the corner of the card to begin with those lovely thin white lines. You can see I'm actually doing this quite swiftly. You want to do it quite quickly. Now I'm using the curved side of the corner, and you can see I've got bigger marks there, so it's really effective. So I'm having a little play here, and I really encourage you to do the same, to practice this technique, because it is so useful. So I am using the corner of the card now, the sharp corner, and this time I'm scratching the surface, not lifting off the paint, but actually scratching the surface. And this is permanent. So I always say make sure you know where you want to scratch out these lines, because you can't remove the scratches. But what happens is when you scratch the surface of the paper to create these thin lines with the corner of the card, the paint, the watercolour paint runs into that scratch and it creates some lovely dark lines. And it's really good for landscape painting when you want to paint stems or distant trees or even sort of grasses. You can actually scratch out. Just be careful that you don't sort of make a hole in the paper, so just scratch into the watercolour paper once. What I'm doing here is I'm actually lifting off again as well, so I've got lighter sort of thin marks there as well. It's so useful. Again, wait for the time to lift off. Don't lift off too soon, because the paint will run back in on itself. So I'm going to be experimenting now, and I really encourage you to experiment. It really builds up confidence and skills in watercolour painting and using these different tools. So I've got indigo wash here. You can use any dark. I've started off with a dark colour and I've added water at the bottom, so I've got a light area. I like to experiment actually dropping in water in there, and it creates back runs because the darker wash there isn't as wet as the water. So if you want to avoid back runs, make sure your paint consistency is the same or neater, drier than the actual paint on the paper. But I quite like experimenting with back runs to see what happens. It creates some lovely natural effects. As you can see here, I'm actually painting in neater paint, creamier paint as well, to create some darks. So now I'm scratching into the surface of the paper with the pointy bit of the plastic card to sort of paint some sort of winter trees. So it's quite nice to do, and it's really effective. And it's good for sort of abstract sort of painting as well, this. And again, I'm lifting out. So lifting off with that swift sort of swiping action. Again, make sure the timing is right, so you don't sort of lift off too soon, because all the paint will run back in. And now I'm sort of painting or scratching out some reflections as well, dropping in a little bit more water, just to create some atmospheric effects and also some textures as well. You can get a little bit carried away, but it's only experimenting, so you can sort of find out the right and wrong ways of doing things when you're experimenting. And I sometimes go a little bit too far, but I quite like that, because then I sort of understand it a little bit more. So do have a go. So I like using a plastic card to paint buildings. So I'm just sort of painting an imaginary skyline here, and I'm wetting the sort of shapes that I've painted with my size 8 brush, just with some water. Now, you remember earlier I said I cut up little piece of the card to fit into my pans. That's what I'm doing here. And remember, I squeeze out paint from a tube, so it's a lot more sort of moist, easier to work with, especially with this technique. So here I go. I've got my sort of pan fully loaded, and I'm just applying it now to the damp paper. And it really does create some really interesting effects. Left hand side is wetter, the right hand side it's dried off a little bit more. So it creates almost the effects of sort of skyscraper buildings there. You can sort of print with the side of the card there as well, pull down, create some lovely textures as well. And I've got some dark areas there, and I'm lifting off to create some lighter areas and textures. And I'm working here, swiping left to right. I'm also using the corner of the card here to create the look of windows there, just using some of the dark paint. I'm also using that sort of long side of the card there to look like cranes or something like that on the skyline. Got a lot of that in London at the moment. And I'm using the brush now to soften some of those darks. The paint's still damp, and I'm just using it to paint some shadows on the left hand side here. So it's really effective in painting buildings. It makes it so much easier. I'm just sort of painting in a little bit of water here, and now I'm actually going to print in some of the reflections as well. So I've dipped the side of the card into some sort of neat tube paint, and it dilutes onto the damp surface there and just creates the most amazing reflections. And I'm using the card to swipe as well to create some horizontal marks in the water. And I'm just now painting a sky wet in wet, just to sort of set the whole scene there, which is quite nice, and just softening some of those marks as well. So for this first painting, I'm going to paint this beautiful seascape painting using the plastic card. And I'm using a large brush to start off with clean water, of course. I've got my little trio pot there. I'll have a link for that in the description. And the palette I'm using is actually the core. It's actually from a core watercolour set, and I've actually just used the base bit. It's like a little mini butcher's tray, so it's brilliant for this. Perfect for filming as well. As you can see there, I just put lots and lots of water, but I have left dry bits as well. And I'm just applying with the plastic card on really into a puddle of paint just to get some lovely effects, some turquoise and some of the quinacridone rust. So you could use Prussian blue and burnt sienna. They do actually make a nice green mixed together, but I'm sort of, when you're squeezing them straight from the tube, and I do sort of encourage that. It's tricky to do it from pans. You can do it if you spray your pans beforehand. For about an hour beforehand, they might get moistened up, but I would say just get a few old tubes of watercolour and have some fun. So I'm just using some of the black and blue now, and sometimes just letting it run into the little puddles. And I actually spattered some puddles as well, so it'll be interesting to see how that goes. Try to be as creative as I can, but this is straight from the tube, so it's like oil painting. It's not your traditional way of painting in watercolour, but you get the best of both worlds. You get those lovely wet in wet washes, all those happy accidents, hopefully, but you get that sort of the creaminess of the colours as well. So I'm just sort of applying it really randomly. So I've got distant headland, I've got horizon line just above halfway, and I'm putting some rocks on the right hand side. I'm keeping it really loose. I'm going to keep a lot of light on that left hand side, just for compositional reasons, going with my gut instincts. And I really encourage you, if you like painting in this style, just sort of use a limited palette and just sort of get creative, get spritzing, get tilting, get creative. As you saw, I was tilting there. What I've decided to do, because it's really thick and creamy at the edge here, I've decided to spray it. And this is actually going to be my sky, believe it or not. So all this paint is running into the wet sky, but I've actually used the spritzer bottle to introduce more water to get that thick, creamy paint moving. So I'm giving it a little tilt here. Look at that gorgeous. That's where I'm using a watercolour block, so it keeps the paper relatively flat for this technique. But you do get little wells and little warpings here and there still, unfortunately. The only other way of doing this is if you wet the back of your paper and stick it onto something that a non-absorbent surface, so it keeps the paper wet when you wet the front of it. But look at that, so atmospheric. I love those colours as well. Cool blues and warm browns, beautiful. So I'm tilting this for a really long time. So don't be in a hurry, take your time. So therapeutic. I can't recommend it enough. It is very messy though, so you might want some old sort of cloths or paper towel on standby when you're spritzing and tilting as I am doing. But look at that light on the right hand side. above just above the horizon there. I like that sort of light. That's the quinacridone rust. So as it's diluted, it's given a lovely glow in the sky. Really like it. But I've left lots of light in the sky as well. Light's really important with this, and also restricting yourself. Take your time. So I'm just using some of the black and the blue, and I'm painting some rocks actually in the water here, and some marks on the top left of the water there. Just again being quite abstract. I was asked a question recently about, because many of you sort of go through my tutorials step by step and you follow them, but then when you come to do your own photographs, you're not quite as confident, or they don't turn out quite as well. So I just think with this, there's a process here. You work light to dark, and there's details and things like that, but it really is a case of less is more, and just sort of create something. Don't try to copy it as such. Keep really open to how the watercolour might be changing rather than a fixed idea from the very beginning. I don't know if you can see here, I'm actually drawing with my card. I haven't actually done this before. I usually do it with my twig, but not my card. And it's really effective. So I'm just using the paint that's actually on the painting and just moving it around and creating little rocks, little sort of lines and marks. I'm just having fun. I really am. I just find this so therapeutic. And what I'm doing now is I'm just painting thick, creamy black and quinacridone rust here, and painting some rocks in the foreground, just using circular movements and just sort of, sort of pasting them on there. Literally, it's like sort of icing a cake or buttering toast or something like that, but you're just sort of creaming on that delicious, yummy paint. And some bits are lighter than others. And I'm leaving that because obviously that could be the light coming above, creating that impression. And it's just, it's just developing. It changes, doesn't it, so much? So I'm just tilting it now because I don't know if you could see there. There was three warping bits in the sky area. So what can happen sometimes if you don't see it, you'll have three sort of big blooms left later. So I'm just tilting for all of that liquid to come down. And while I'm doing that, I thought I'd give my sort of the left-hand side of the sea area and rocks a little spritz. And you might want to have lots of paper towels on standby because this can be very messy. So I'm just sort of tickling the paint here with some water to get it to run down. Sometimes when you use the plastic card and you've got lots of paint on it, it doesn't sort of move on the watercolour paper because it's quite thick and creamy. So I'm just introducing some water here. You could use a pipette to do this as well, and I would have done if I'd got them out, but I'm in the sort of throes of painting this. I don't want to stop myself by hunting for my pipette. So I'm doing the same thing here on the left hand side here, these distant sort of bit of distant land here. I just don't want something hard and sort of dark on the edge of my painting because it'll take your eye out of the painting. So I'm giving the foreground a little spritz here as well. It was a bit dark. The black can be quite a tricky colour, so just if you're using black, don't be worried if you have to spritz away. Look at all that mess. I did say it was messy. So I've let my painting dry off a little bit, and I'm just sort of swiping my card to lift off some light at the top of the rocks. So even though this is an abstract painting, I'd sort of almost call it semi-abstract because, things are kind of almost don't look like anything, and then suddenly these look like rocks and sky and distant land. So it's quite nice to have a mixture of them both and just be open to sort of happy accidents turning into something really interesting and maybe quite beautiful as well. And I think that's what the thing is about that I love about watercolour. It is such a beautiful medium. It creates this lovely light, as you can see that hopefully you think I've achieved it in the distance there. And I'm just sort of putting on a little bit more of the quinacridone gold here. I haven't used much of the quinacridone gold actually, and I think in the back of my mind I didn't want my sky to go green, so I've kept away from it. And it's a beautiful colour, but it mixed with that turquoise it could go a little bit green. I'm just giving a little spritz here in the middle on the right hand side just to get some things happening. It may not have come across here on the film, but the turquoise paint has created some lovely texture both in the sky and in the water there as well. It's not granulation, but there's this lovely sort of special effect it's got almost. It's quite beautiful. I'm just scratching out now this creamy paint. So don't scratch out when it's too wet, or the paint will all just run back into the scratch. So you want to sort of, when I say scratch out, I mean scratch out and lift off. So you lift off light. One of the favourite things I love to do is I like to scratch into the paper as well where it's wet. And if I give you a little close up here, I'm actually sort of drawing these winter trees by scratching into the paper to make dark lines, or just pulling them out like I did earlier when I was drawing those little rocks there. So there's so many little techniques you can do with a plastic card. It's so much fun. And if you're worried about it, just get a sketchbook or the back of an old watercolour painting that didn't quite work and have a little go. It's so much fun. I'm scratching out a little bit on the horizon there as well, just for some more texture. Now I'm actually got a little blob of white gouache. It's Winsor & Newton's white gouache. You could use white watercolour, or white acrylic ink, or white acrylics, whatever you've got to hand. I've watered it down a little bit. I'm using my size 6 brush and I'm just spattering wet on dry just around where I think there might be a little bit of sort of spray for some from the sea itself, and just to create some texture and light. It also stops me from fiddling with my painting. One of the things we're all guilty of, I'm sure. It's all that less is more is so important. So I'm just giving that a good spatter, and as you can see, I use some paper towel to protect my sky. I didn't want any white blobs on my sky. I don't mind it sometimes, but this instant I just wanted to have that lovely sort of textures just in the foreground and middle distance of the sea there. I've removed my paper towel. I'm just using that white that's very watered down, sort of really watered down, just glazing on this left hand corner. I wanted to get a little bit more light back, which was my original intention. So I'm just glazed a little bit white there just to create some softness, maybe some mistiness. And I'm painting a little bit on the top left, well, just the top of the sea here on the left, just to push back some of those marks. I'm removing my framing tape. Now, I did have a little bit of a leakage there. Sometimes it just happens. I probably remember I sprayed loads of water that side. It probably didn't press it down enough and it just leaked. It's fine, but I still get a nice white border everywhere else. And this tape really comes off nicely on this Winsor & Newton paper. I find other papers sometimes tear. I do say do blow dry your tape with a hairdryer so that it softens the glue on the tape, and sometimes it makes it easier to remove. So I should have done this beforehand. So I've got to go to the trouble of using all the paper towel now to make sure my painting is protected. But I wanted to spatter some darks as well. But sometimes, do you know what it was? It's because I removed the tape. The idea, came then, and that's why that white border is so important, because it gives you ideas. You look at your painting in a much more objective way. So I'm basically just spattering some blacks, some dark blues, whatever you fancy. You could spatter a little bit of brown for some warmth, but that really does make a difference, and it brings that foreground forwards as well, because it's got darks and textures. And I thought I might spatter a little bit here in this bottom left hand foreground here. So I've just got to protect my paper again. It's quite good fun though, using the paper towel that way as well, but I'm just giving that a little spatter as well, just a little bit of texture, really just to balance out that right hand side. So that's really kind of, just important. Go with your gut instincts. So here again is the finished painting, and I really hope you've enjoyed the spattering, just using a limited palette, the use of the plastic card, the spattering, using white paint, and just having lots of fun and being creative, painting in this abstract way, using the watercolours like oil paints. So I'm going to use similar colours here for this semi-abstract cityscape with reflections. I'm using just a ice cream tub here, something big enough for the brush here. It's a goat head brush. I got it from Amazon a couple of years ago, very inexpensive, but it's just nice to just swish on lots of water on this large sheet of paper. It's half imperial, so it's about 22 by 15 inches thereabouts, but with the framing tape, not gum tape, so I'm not stretching the paper. I've just sort of gone around the edges so I get a nice white border. so don't confuse it with the gum tape, which looks very similar. So here I am, a lovely close-up here of me with my little palette here, using my plastic card, which is an ordinary store card cut up. I'm using orange, I'm using black, I'm using blues, I'm using quinacridone gold. I will put a full list of all the materials I'm using in the description below. But as you can see here, all the puddles of water are sort of taking my paint and maneuvering it on, and you're getting all these kind of happy accidents, which I don't know, just go with them, you know, don't overwork them, don't fiddle. With watercolour, less is more. It really is. I can't stress it enough. So when you see something magical happening, don't disturb it too much, you know, let it do its thing. It's really important with this kind of technique. So let it go, almost let the paint do the talking if you can. Got another flat brush here, just a cheapy flat brush I use for my acrylic paintings. Actually, it's synthetic. You can even use a household paintbrush, anything, any large brush. Now the paint has dried off a little, and I'm just using the plastic card now just to kind of paint buildings, you know, sort of construct them, you know, just by that sort of movement, you know, just sort of getting creamy paint and painting on, or just moving the paint that's on the surface. Finessing here just to kind of give a little bit of detail with some nice creamy dark paint. And I have actually painted something similar to this. Well, I'll put a link in the description below. There's actually a couple, so I'll put them both on there. So I'm spritzing again here. I've got some of the darks on the sort of water's edge. So you see there a close up there. I've spritzed it. That lovely turquoise is coming out really nicely there. So I'm just finishing off now, just that final sort of big tilt that I'm doing there, as you can see, and just letting that paint all run down so it looks like lovely reflections. So this is the finished painting. I have not done any more to it. Normally I would do a little bit more, but I've kept it really, really simple. So I hope you've enjoyed it. So I hope you're going to enjoy this landscape here where I use plastic card and salt techniques for my third painting. I'm using a large soft head brush and I'm wetting the paper, sort of the top part here to represent the sky, but also the bottom part, some land, etc. And I'm going to base this loosely on a landscape. I'm using a plastic store card cut up and I'm just starting off with a little bit of Prussian blue. And I'm sort of placing this on the damp paper, and this is freshly squeezed paint, and I'm adding a little bit of quinacridone gold to that colour there to make a lovely green. And if you notice just above there, that paper is dry there, so I like to have a bit of control having a dried area of paper. I'm just applying a little bit more of that blue. So basically, I'm starting off in quite a random way, but loosely basing it on landscapes. And I quite like this way of working in watercolour painting, where you can just loosely start off and see what happens, especially working on a wet surface. You can see all the paint is running up there, and I find it so inspiring. It's very unpredictable, and this is a very experimental style, but I feel that beginners and improvers can really play around with this and find their inner artist just by sort of experimenting in this way. You just need a handful of colours. I'm just applying Payne's Grey and quinacridone gold here onto the damp surface, just using a plastic card. And you can cut the card up in sort of different sizes as well to dip it in to your paints. I find tube paints the best, but if you have pans and don't have tubes, just give your pans a spray beforehand, about half an hour beforehand, to moisten them up. But it's always better with tubes. But what happens is they go very random, especially when you use the plastic card, and really magical things can happen. And my advice is, when you see something magical, just allow it to sort of flow. And that's what I'm doing here, just tilting and allowing the paints to flow, sort of guiding them, but just letting things happen by itself. And it does so with watercolour paints, especially. Water and paint, what can be more magical than that? And I find teaching this to my face-to-face students over a number of years, whether they're beginners or they've been painting for years, everyone's on an even sort of keel here, and they just all enjoy it so much. And I just always say to them, just let it happen. Don't sort of guide it, but don't sort of interfere too much with the process. So I'm just painting a sky here using a large mop synthetic brush, and it's a little bit of the phthalo blue and a touch of cerulean, and I'm tilting to allow the paint to run down to look atmospheric. And as you can see there, I've left the white of the paper still in that dry area. It's always good to have some light. So I'm just mopping up puddles as well with a clean, damp brush. And what's great about working in a sketchbook, it allows you to loosen up and experiment. So I'm just adding a little bit of that phthalo blue at the bottom to represent maybe some water. And now I'm sprinkling on some table salt onto the damp paint. And what that does, it absorbs the paint to create some wonderful light textures. Also sprinkling it onto the trees area here. It may not work, but I always kind of like to have a little go and see what happens. I've got a puddle here, so I'm just using a clean damp brush just to soak up the paint to stop it from running into the sky area. Sometimes that can cause a cauliflower or a bloom when wet paint runs into damp paint or paint that's nearly dry. So again, just collecting puddles at the top here with a clean, damp brush. And I'm just getting a dilute phthalo blue, painting wet on dry with my size 10 round brush, just to create some reflections in this water area. And I'm adding a little bit more blue there, but still keeping the light in this area. So just a touch more of that beautiful phthalo blue. I'm just dampening the bottom of the trees and bringing wet water into that water area just to soften that bank of trees. And what I'm doing now is I'm actually using a plastic card to scratch the surface of the paper. And what that does is paint runs into the scratch to create some really thin, dark lines. This is permanent, so I would recommend practicing this technique because you can't reverse it. If you're not sure about it, you could wait for your painting to dry to paint thin, dark lines with a brush. But I'm sort of turning sideways here and just sort of scratching in with the card to create tree trunks and branches. I find using alternative tools a really great way of sort of getting in touch with our inner artists, because sometimes when you use traditional tools like pencils and paintbrushes, we tend to tighten up. But I find from my own experience, but also teaching students, that once you give them sort of other things to play with and experiment with, it seems to really help them get in touch with their inner artists. They feel more confident, they're having fun and they're playing, experimenting. I also like painting upside down. I like to look at the painting from a different viewpoint. At the end of the day, painting's all about shape and colour, line, direction, textures, you name it. So I'm just scratching into this wet sort of area to create more detail, more tree trunks and branches. So I'm just sort of lifting off some of the paint here. Another great thing you can do with a plastic card to create the look of grasses, etc. Just more textures and details, especially in the foreground, because it kind of creates depth in your painting. So here's a close-up here. You can see the salt has created some wonderful textures, especially in the foreground. I also like those sort of grey rocks just above as well, and that was with the Payne's grey. So for my fourth painting, I'm going to paint this really sort of almost abstract cityscape scene using just a handful of colours, plastic card and even a wooden peg. Let's have a look. The paper, as you see, I've wet it and I'm just sort of gently manoeuvring the paint along this paper here. Any of the art supplies that I've used here, I'm going to put in the description below, a list of them, but also links to where you can actually purchase them. So as you can see, I'm just making lots of different sorts of shapes and things here, working wet on wet, but I've actually left little dry bits on the paper as well. As you can see, I was using the paint neat from the palette. So just tilting here, getting all the paint to run down. This sort of technique is completely random. It's completely creative. You never know quite what you're going to get. Here's a close-up version using the big flat brush. I'm not necessarily painting with this brush. I'm just using it to maneuver the paint while it's wet to draw it down to the bottom. The brown tape I've used there is framing tape. I find that's actually a little bit easier on the watercolour paper, so it doesn't tend to rip, but sometimes it does, depending on how fast I've removed it. But I'm just sort of hardly touching the paper here, just pulling the paint down gently. As you can see, I've only just used 4 of the set of the M Grain watercolours, but what beautiful colours they are. That turquoise, the rust colour, the violet coming through, stunning. And I thought it'd be perfect for an urban scene. So I'm just using an ordinary, it's an AA card actually, cut up in half, but you can actually cut it in all sorts of different sort of sizes depending on what your needs are. The paint's still quite wet. I'm just sort of manoeuvring it. I've just dipped it into some more paint, just putting in now the start of some of my taller buildings. Just using that damp brush again, not fully loaded with water, just slightly loaded, just pulling that paint down to the edge of my framing tape. spraying. I'm using the Atelier spray bottle, but any spray bottle will work. Even sort of, you know, if you've used household detergent, you can empty that out and then just put clean water in there, and you know you're ready to go. So just keep mopping up. I find a J cloth quite useful actually for mopping up, so you can keep rinsing it out instead of keep using paper towels sometimes because you feel like you're using loads. So this way it works quite well. But look how those colours are blended. It's quite beautiful. I mean, I'm so inspired by this. Just, you know, not having to use brushes here, just using an old plastic card. How amazing is that? So the paint's slightly drying a bit now, so I can sort of get a little bit more control. Still working damp into damp. Just pulling down some of my reflections now. Just tilting the watercolor pad, giving it another little spray, because when the paint's not moving, I'll just give it a little spray, letting it run down, pulling it down again with the brush, just for these reflections, for the larger reflections. And again, when the paint's not moving, I'll give it a little spray, keeping the gum pad on a tilt, letting everything run down, as reflections would do as well. Now, this is a neat little trick. These are just the keys that you get on the back of a canvas that it stretches. It's for the stretcher bars to stretch them out. But I find them so useful for making mark making. I use them a lot in my acrylic painting, but here I'm just using them to put little windows in, just the tip of the little wooden peg here, just putting in some little windows for my tall buildings. And the paper, my actual watercolor paper is slightly damp, so I haven't actually done any blow drying. So this is still, you know, sort of literally 20 minutes into the painting. So I'm just putting some little random windows here, working on the left-hand side. You've almost got to just go with your gut instinct, really. I've just taken off a little bit of paint that I thought was a bit too dark. So just putting random windows in here, just little bits of detail, you know, sort of not overworking the painting. But you can see it's such a nice little tool to use, you know, instead of just throwing them away or what have you, you can just keep them in your little art box and do certain things to them, you know, just create little bits of detail. The colours that I'm using are just, as you can see, there's violet and there's turquoise and the quinacridone rust. So there's there's lots of colour mixing going on in my palette as well, putting these darks on. Just going to go in with the plastic card again to put some edges on these buildings. So it's kind of like all three dark colours again mixed up together. And my paper is still slightly damp, but it's nearly dry, so that as you can see, these marks, they're not running now. You know, it's safe to kind of put as long as the paint that you're using is thicker than what's going on on your actual watercolor painting surface, the paint won't run or move. You've got plenty of control over it. Mind you, sometimes it's very exciting when, you know, you're kind of getting backgrounds and things like that. So, you know, I'm always open to ideas, especially painting in this way. It's so creative. It's fun. And I've actually been painting this, using this style with my classes at the moment, teaching my students. And I would say 80% of the students are open to the ideas of it. I would say 60% love it. They absolutely love it. It's so different. And even though I've said to them, you might have to have 2 or 3 goes at it just to get used to it, but just be open to different ideas, you know, painting in this way. It's quite a new sort of way of treating watercolor. We're so used to using lovely soft sable brushes. Here, this is all done by a card, spray bottle, and a little bit of brush manipulation. But I'm just using the edge of this wooden peg now, just almost drawing with it. I'm putting another building in the center of this painting, just making some more marks. As you can see, the paint is still slightly damp because I managed to still scrape off some paint, and I'm using what I've scraped off and putting it in the left hand side to put some more kind of misty buildings in the background. It feels like quite a safe way of painting, even though this looks quite abstract. It feels like you can just sort of do stuff with the watercolor more so. I feel more in control, believe it or not. And I just love these M. Graham watercolors. I mean, they're beautiful together. They're absolutely stunning. It just creates that sort of I don't know, a foggy sort of day in London, or a cityscape where it's sort of misty, but you still have these lovely colours coming through, the purples, the turquoise, the yellow ochres. So I'm still working on detail on these windows here, plugging away, haven't stopped, sort of just feeling my way into this painting. Can't tell you how excited I am about it. I just absolutely love it. I could just paint like this all day long. And, if you've got any questions about what I'm doing here, please put it in the comments below and I'll try and get back to you, because I'd love to share this with you all. It's just wonderful. That little tube there was a Winsor & Newton white watercolour paint. And I've just put a little drop of it on my palette here, using my plastic card again, because sometimes with this technique you might get, not, I wouldn't say muddy, but you're losing a little bit of your lights because of all the spraying, etc. So I'm just putting on some white watercolour at the end here for a little bit of sparkle, like there's lights going on in some of these buildings, just to sharpen up where it's got slightly dull. It's a really nice way of finishing off the watercolour. So I really hope you like my fifth and last watercolour painting here of Barton Cliffs using the plastic card and lots of other yummy techniques. Let's take a look. Now I've wet the surface and I'm just pulling out some Green Apatite Genuine by Daniel Smith, but you could use sap green or mix your own green using a blue and yellow. This is Wet in Wet and I'm painting using my size 10 round brush. I'm just putting a little bit of French ochre in there. You could use quinacridone gold or raw sienna as well, and just mixing those colours literally in the palette but also on the watercolour paper, working wet in wet. Just really lots of this in this foreground area here, creating lots of strong colours. I'm now adding a little bit of Payne's grey, quite a creamy mixture, working damp into wet in the foreground there. I'm sprinkling on some table salt while the paint is damp, and I'm going to let that dry naturally. Meanwhile, I'm using a plastic store card cut up, just pulling out this damp paint to create some grasses and textures in the foreground here, keeping everything really simple. It's a really fun way of using and painting watercolours in this really loose, semi-abstract style. You're creating happy accidents on the way. I'm using some cerulean blue now, working wet on dry with my size 14 round brush, and just creating sort of horizontal marks there, sort of coming up to the shoreline there. As you can see where the wax resist is working quite nicely, so it's protecting that light area there. I'm using the belly of the brush as well to create some dry brush effect, to create some sparkles here and there. I've gone back using the plastic card now. I've dipped it into some turquoise and I'm just creating some more marks, damp into damp in the sea area there, just to create a little bit of drama. I'm using this plastic card as well to create and paint or print even some distant land, wet on dry, but it's catching the wet surface of the sea area there. I've added a little bit of pink and the blue, the turquoise blue here, just to give an impression of distant land. And I'm spritzing now with my spritzer bottles, so the colour that I've used to create the distant land is also going to act as the sky as well. It's going to run up into the sky to create a lovely soft sort of violet blue sky there. So I'm tipping and wiping the excess water there with the paper towels. You can see it's created a nice atmospheric look there. Using my size 6 brush now with a mix of Payne's grey with a touch of that violet blue colour that I made, working damp into damp, just to smooth out that area, and it really does create a lovely atmospheric effect there. Going back with the card again and just defining some of the cliffs here, the top of the cliffs, using the Green Apatite Genuine, working damp into damp. You can see in the foreground there, the salt is actually working quite nicely, creating textures. What it does, it sort of soaks up the paint and creates these lovely light textured marks there. It can be quite exciting. And I'll put a link in the description below of a tutorial that I made recently all about using salt. troubleshooting any problems that you may have using it as well. I'm using a little bit of quinacridone rust here. You could use burnt sienna and some orange as well. I wanted this part of the cliff here to be the focal point so that colour really stands out, and I'm just using a little bit of the green apatite genuine, a touch of Payne's grey, even a little bit of violet, and just sort of painting the cliffs just behind there, and also the foreground cliff as well, coming down, working wet on dry. I'm actually lifting out some of that orange. I felt it was a little bit bright. I'm adding a little bit of water there to help me lift off with my paper towel. I'm adding a little bit of yellow now to the surface. Really, you can see this is very, very wet, and I'm hoping I'll get some exciting happy accidents and some back runs there. I'm using a little bit more of this yellow here in the distance, working wet on dry, and just finessing the cliffs here using my size 10 brush. I'm literally drawing with the plastic card with some Payne's grey there, just to give some little bit of texture on the cliffs there and the rocks, and just printing with the plastic card here, damp into damp onto the top of the cliffs there, just to define them a little bit more with the green apatite genuine. Again, you could use something like sap green. I'm also adding a little bit of Payne's grey now to the bottom of the cliffs there, to sort of show a little bit of darks there, and to have that contrast between the sea and the rocks as well. And using the card, which is so much fun. You can be so creative with this card, and it takes away all of those reservations you may have with watercolour, worried about making mistakes. When you've got the card in the hand, it kind of frees you up and allows you to create something. I'm sort of not copying this photograph. What I'm doing is interpreting it. I'm using the photograph as a reference. I don't want to copy every little detail. It's a scene that I'm familiar with. I took this photograph the other day, so I want to give that feeling that I had as well, and that's where the abstraction comes in a little bit, not sort of painting all the details, not making things look realistic, just going with the flow of the painting, seeing where it takes me, so it doesn't have to end up looking like that photo. As you can see, I still haven't dried the painting yet. I'm sort of using the plastic card there to paint in some grasses, using the green apatite genuine, and now using my brush just to paint some details on the sort of star of the show here, this orangey sort of cliff here, and just painting and working and softening the marks that I've made there. I'm going to allow my painting now to dry naturally. Here is the painting dried, and you can see the salt has really worked well in the foreground there, creating some lovely light textures. I'm using some white gouache now, and I'm spattering the foreground rocks, working wet on dry to create some texture, to give the illusion of a wave crashing against the rocks, even though it's not in the photograph. I just like to do this, and it also stops me from overworking my paintings. I've also added some white gouache to that violet that I made earlier, and I'm spattering some sort of violet pretty wildflowers as well to finish off my painting. I'm removing the washi tape now to reveal a lovely light border, and it gives me time to assess to see if I need to do any more to my painting, but I think I'll leave it there for now. I'm really pleased with it, and I really hope you found this tutorial helpful, bringing together 5 of my semi-abstract tutorials showing you how I use the plastic card. If you have any questions questions, please put them in the comments section. If you'd like to support the content that I create here on YouTube, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about the membership can be found in the description below, but you'll get access to my longer, more in-depth tutorials, exclusive tutorials, and downloadable outline sketches, and you can cancel anytime. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.